Good morning, guys. I wanted to take a few minutes today just to talk a little bit about the basics and the elements of crime fiction or murder mystery fiction, and also add just a couple of comments about Sherlock Holmes and the Sherlock Holmes stories, particularly A Study in Scarlet, which we'll be reading this week. Apologies that I am getting this up Tuesday instead of Monday. Trying to do this yesterday, I ran into some technical issues I hadn't anticipated, so I managed to get two of the videos done yesterday, but I still have yours and one other to do today, so I appreciate your patience. So let's talk first of all, have you read The Guilty Vicarage to get some ideas about crime fiction, the genre generally, and I want to add to that a little bit. So I want you to think about, for example, why this kind of fiction seems to appeal to us, seems to be such an enduring genre, starting in the sort of latter part of the 19th century. But it is probably the best-selling genre and the most popular genre perhaps on television, one of the most popular on television, and then probably in films as well. So one way to think about crime fiction is to think about what crime it does, and particularly what murder does. So let's think about it this way. So either in real life or in crime fiction, we begin with the status quo in the community, right? We have the sort of life going on sort of as it always does. That status quo then is disrupted by the murder. Murder is the primary taboo. It is the worst taboo. The killing of another human being by a human is the most unthinkable taboo. And so it destabilizes the status quo when a murder happens. So what has to happen then is that there has to be the pursuit of the person who committed the murder, right? There has to be pursuit. And so what does that involve? That involves someone who is in charge of the pursuit, so someone who is going to solve this crime, find the murderer, and bring the murderer to, find the person who's culpable of this crime, and then who is going to bring that murderer to justice. So there has to be someone who is in pursuit, police detective, perhaps an amateur detective, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, what we call the genius detective, right? But someone has to take up the pursuit of the culpable individual. There has to be evidence that is collected, and so someone has to be responsible for finding that evidence. So there are suspects who may be culpable of the crime. There has to be a process of sifting through the data and the evidence, of suspecting individuals, and then finding a way to prove that those individuals, some of them are innocent, and then eventually, of course, finding the guilty person, finding the culpable person, bringing that person then to justice, right? Making that person part of the justice system, and then there has to be punishment for the crime that was committed, and then that punishment, that bringing the person to justice, reestablishes the status quo, right? Reestablishes security. When there's been a murder, the community feels unsettled, the community feels suspicious of other members of the community, particularly if you have an enclosed group of suspects. Perhaps, as is often the case in murder mysteries, you have people in one setting who are all potentially guilty. So those people become suspicious of one another. And so the community, the security of the community has been destabilized. And the trust within the community has been disturbed. And so the pursuit of the criminal and bringing the culpable individual to justice, punishing that individual, reestablishes the trust, reestablishes the security of the community, and reestablishes the status quo. So one of the reasons that murder mysteries or crime fiction tend to be so satisfying is that there is a satisfactory outcome, right? Except in very, very few cases. The murderer, the identity of the murderer is established and the murderer is brought to justice. The murderer is punished. And so the cycle is complete. We feel as readers or viewers, we feel satisfied, we feel happy, and it functions in crime fiction in ways, sadly, it doesn't always function in real life, right? If you talk to someone who works as part of a group of detectives or works for the police force, they don't, in fact, solve every crime. They don't always get to bring someone to justice. There are crimes that go unsolved for sometimes decades and sometimes forever. So it's a very satisfactory kind of fiction in that way. All right, so let's think as well. Sorry, got to find a way to get this off here. So let's think about, again, what are the elements of crime fiction, right? So there's, generally we begin with a murder, right? So a murder has been committed. That's kind of hard, that may be hard to read because it's still wet. Let me try that again. So there has to be a murder, right? We start with a murder. Then there are suspects, and there will be a group of them. There will be more than one, because the bulk of the novel, the bulk of the story, right, is sorting through those suspects. And each one of them has to have some kind of potential motive, or he or she wouldn't be a suspect, right? So, and there are red herrings, there are motives, what we call red herrings, right, that are false trails. And our detective or group of detectives or pair of detectives spend some time tracking down the motives, tracking down the evidence, and so on, right? So there has to be evidence, data, right? So clues. Sometimes we think of these as clues, as in the game, clue. So our detective, we have to have a detective. Maybe professional, maybe amateur, tracking down the clues, sorting through the clues, going down some false trails, sorting through the suspects, collecting alibis, right? They have to have alibis. Where were you? What were you doing when the murder was committed, right? So you've got to sort through those. So you have witnesses and suspects who add to the evidence, right? And then there's going to be the big solution, which generally happens at the end. There very often is that scene at the end where the detective then explains how he or she has solved the crime, and there's the big reveal. Here's who did it. And then we're bringing justice prevails and the perpetrator is brought to justice. Couple of words about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the first of what we call the genius detectives, right? He's an amateur. He's not in the police force, but he consistently outsmarts the police through his system of deductive logic. So he's a genius detective. A couple of things that Conan Doyle did to establish really the genre of crime fiction. One is that he has, even though he wrote short stories that were serialized in the Strand magazine, and most of our crime fiction now is in the form of novels, he created a character who appears in every story. So we find out a little bit more about the character and his eccentricities in each story. But having that recurring character has become very popular, and that's really become an important kind of crime fiction. Those tend to be the best-selling crime fiction novels, those that have one character who appears in the same detective who appears in each novel. So Agatha Christie did that with Miss Marple and with Hercule Poirot, and then even more recently, Michael Connelly's novels featured police detective Harry Bosch, and we'll read one of those novels later. The other kind of important tradition or convention that he established is that the detective doesn't usually tell the story, because if the detective figures things out all along the way, and we know that, we're thinking along with the detective, then we're going to know the answer to the puzzle, sooner rather than later, and there's no story. So typically somebody else, narrates. Very often, so for example, in Sherlock Holmes stories, right, then who is it? It's Dr. Watson, who is the sidekick to Sherlock Holmes. Dr. Watson is sort of speaks for us, the readers. We don't know what's going on, and he doesn't either, and he asks questions. He's a reasonably intelligent person, but he's not a genius like Sherlock Holmes. In Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot stories, it's Hastings, who is a good friend of Hercule Poirot, and again, he's kind of asking questions and trying to figure things out. So there's somebody else narrating that story. I hope you have a good time reading the first Sherlock Holmes story. You've got PowerPoints to look at that will give you more context for the character and that story. And I will get the discussion board topic and the quiz up for you today. Bye for now.